Hi, my name's Lindsay, and welcome back to the world of Anton Chekov's Gooseberries, as designed by me. Last time I showcased my interpretation of Ivan Ivanich's costume design, but in this video, I will be presenting my design for the overall world and sets of the story for an intended live-action feature film adaptation. To reiterate, the short story was published in 1898, so for this interpretation we'll be working under the assumption that the current story setting is roughly set in the year 1895 in the Russian Empire, as no other specific year is stated in the source material. As opposed to my last design, which was strictly naturalistic, this time I'll be branching out and going for a more stylized design approach, whilst rooting the basis for my designs in historical, period-accurate realism, with the focus of this presentation on Nikolai and Alokin's estates and the comparison between them. To begin with, we need to specify where in Russia the story and these estates are located, for the purposes of farming and agriculture for which both these estates are intended. When looking at a map of Russia and the main regions with arable land, these areas are primarily located in southern Russia. However, the Russian Empire of the time reached out further than the current borders we know today, reaching into modern-day Ukraine, which is right by southern Russia, and is abundant with arable farmland. For the purposes of my design, I am placing Nikolai's estate in what we now know as southern Russia. As for Alokin's estate, the story states the village of Sofino, spelt with a PH. However, there isn't a village known as Sofino under that spelling. The closest I can find is Sofino, spelt with an F instead, which is located in the southeast of Ukraine. So, for the purposes of my design, we will be placing Alokin's estate in what we now know as modern-day Ukraine, with landscapes like this. An important detail brought up was that Nikolai always looked for a farmland by a river, as that's what he remembered from his childhood. So, here for the landscapes for both locations, I've chosen landscapes that have a mix of hills with surrounding forestry and flat land for the estates to reside on, all set by a river, with the inclusion of actual gooseberries there, both the actual fruit up close in the top right, and also the shrub-like bush that they grow on down the bottom there, that we'd find around these estates as a particular point of importance for the story. For the estates themselves, I've taken a lot of inspiration from what they'd be in real life, being what's known as a dacha, a second holiday home for a lot of wealthy upper-class people. The first dachas were built in the 17th century, with the land initially being given to the highest class of aristocrats of the Russian Empire by Peter the Great himself as a gift. It wasn't until the 19th century as professions of high income changed in society and that ushered in a new upper class of people who also wanted in and started building their own dachas. Which brings us to Nikolai's estate, taking inspiration from real architectural designs from 1873 to 1880, which in this timeline of the story would be around the same time Nikolai would have been planning out his future estate. I wanted to convey the overly pompous and grand appearance of wealth in this design. Nikolai's one goal in life is to achieve this gluttonous nobleman status, so in the design he doesn't hold back in showing off his wealth. With the architectural design being rooted in very iconic Russian design, I love the spires, the teardrop-like dome spires that are uniquely Russian and a symbol of grandeur, as seen here in the examples on the right and the top. And even the uniquely Russian Orthodox crosses, taking inspiration from cathedral designs. I've chosen the example in the top left for the landscape of the estate. Whilst the actual estate is grand, the surrounds are described as terribly planned, with no paths or clear layout, in stark contrast to Alokin's, which we'll see later. Here, the land is drab, situated between two factories, so I wanted to show the dark and chaotic environment around it. It's all very unkempt and quite lifeless, with a very grey and sullen colour palette, giving a very cold and unhappy feeling, with the real-life example there at the bottom showcasing the scale. This is something that I would approach either through a miniature model or CGI. I drew a lot of inspiration from St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, again with the spires and the scale, but also taking the colour palette and floral patterns and colours that we see in the interior of the cathedral into the interior of the estate. I've taken that colour palette, those reds and greens and blues, and really tried to make the interior dark, but rich in those colours. We see here as well the ornate cutouts, trimmings and embezzlements of the dark oak wood and furniture, all held up by columns, The interior spaces are cluttered with expensive furniture, art, and statues to envelop everything in that sense of indulgence and gluttony, being surrounded by it and showing off his wealth. Every room has to outdo the next in scale and possessions and appearance, all culminating to what we see there on the left and up top in the library/study area, which is where I see the story that Ivan is telling would take place. The study is this crowning jewel of the estate, Nikolai's enormous library of things, the scale being overblown for effect, and carrying those ornate floral patterns throughout the other rooms of the manor, in the wallpaper, the drapes, the rugs, and the furniture pieces. Everything is in your face, everything has substance and texture and wealth behind it. This plays as a stark contrast to a Loken's estate. I've gone more comparatively modest. Whilst Alokin still obviously is very wealthy in that he owns his own estate, in comparison, he seems more down to earth and doesn't show off as much, carrying the idea that he doesn't really spend much time in his house throughout the design. He's more the type of person who will be out in the field or gardens working, as we see. So I've gone for a softer and more nature-driven palette, with more whites and pastels for the interiors and stylings, as seen in this example with the subtle light floral wallpaper and even the little detail of plants by the windowsill. The space isn't cluttered. The overall design is more real, without the spires and overwhelming scale. The manor isn't meant to stick out of the environment, rather the nature around it is the display, with paths maintained and leading to practical stables as we see in the bottom left, brimming with life and farm life. The design is brighter and more inviting. Looking at the top left, the architecture is also more modern for the time and more squared off than Nikolai's dramatic angles, with the inside almost untouched. The example down the bottom is from St. Petersburg Heritage Museum. This would be the reception area of the estate. The pieces are less cluttered. They are there for show, but not to show off. The other important place in the story on Alokin's estate is the bathhouse, or banya in Russian, a small sauna-like cabin down by the river. Alokin is again modest. It's not grand or elaborate, it's just a log cabin. Its purpose is practicality, that anyone is free to use. The scale is small and the wood texture unpolished and raw. There's nothing remarkable about the architectural design. It's intended to be realistic and familiar, but still a novelty and luxury for those in the city to escape to. Overall, it's relaxed. The whole estate is light and warm and comforting, a place where you can find peace in the nature. To conclude, I have here Surokov's painting The Morning of the Streltsy Execution, which I think perfectly encapsulates the style I'm trying to create. In the painting, we can see the grand Russian design of St. Basil's Cathedral in the background, with the crowd of people in the foreground. They are all dressed in quite vibrant colours and patterns, but contrasting all of that, contrasting the grandeur and the colour, the painting depicts something far more sinister and miserable, showing people of all different classes in a very violent struggle that translates into the very real everyday class struggle in society. We see this class struggle presented in a very nihilistic way through Gooseberries, and that's what I've tried to make through this design. Thank you for watching.